Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we're so grateful that you can join us. And let me give you kind of an overview of what we're going to cover the next 2 hours. Next hour, we will spend some time getting back into the news. We're going to talk about Ukraine and talking about some of the controversy that has developed in terms of reporting. So we'll get into that. Also want to follow a few things happening in Congress. So we'll actually devote an entire hour, next hour, to looking at issues in the news. But as I shared yesterday, we're going to talk about this idea of sexual sin, sexual temptation, pornography, and the rest. Because we're going to do that this hour, let me just give you a parental advisory. We'll be very careful about what we say, but I recognize that sometimes young children listen to the program while you're listening to it as well. So I wanted to give that to you as well and encourage you to take appropriate steps. Going to be talking about this book, Unmuzzled. It is a book that I would highly recommend to you. Josh McDowell said every man should read this book. Well, that's a pretty good recommendation. And you will find that we have information about the book as well as the guest that is with us. J.S. Shelton is with us, and he is really on a mission to confront this issue of sexual sin in the church, and really has tried to help people understand, as the subtitle says, escaping sexual sin and Satan's grip on men. It's a conversation we've had with people like Stephen Arterburn, who was with us last week, Josh McDowell, all of who've been in the studio with us, but I guess we're allowed to call you Jeremy. So, Jeremy Shelton, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Awesome to be here.
I might just mention that you have more recently been on with Janet Parshall, and so people might also want to hear that interview. But first of all, we need to maybe just set the scene, because you talk about early on in the book, not sex, you talk about cars, but it also, I think, illustrates again this issue of temptation that actually is a theme that runs all the way through the book.
Absolutely. Yeah, we started the book with a chapter that used to be chapter 17. Now it's chapter 1. And it's about a young man that entered our car dealership, and we were selling a car for him on consignment. A few years later, he's in prison for possession and distribution for child pornography.
It's just amazing. And again, you just remind us that what happens very quickly to individuals. And of course, we also recognize that, as Stephen Arterburn says, it's every man's challenge, every man's threat, and all that. And of course, you do spend some time talking about escaping sexual sin. But before we talk about the escape, let's talk about the title, Unmuzzled. And you muzzle a dog for a number of different reasons. It wasn't until I read that section of your book that I thought, oh yeah, I always think you muzzle a dog because they might bite, but there's some other reasons for it, and you use that then to help us understand the rest of the book. So talk about that.
Yeah, it was a vision that I saw on a man years and years ago, and the vision came from him just being a passive man. Mm-hmm. I couldn't understand why he wasn't willing to pray. And I talk about the muzzle in the relation, like, you can't pray if you're muzzled. In other words, you can't speak if you're muzzled. It's one of the reasons, you muzzle a dog is to prevent it from barking, from crying out to the Lord is how I relate it, from praying over your wife and your children. When you're muzzled, you can't pray. And sexual sin muzzles a man from being the spiritual leader of his home.
So again, whether it's eating, whether it's barking, or whether it's biting, there are some different aspects of that. And I guess real early on, we need to maybe take on a couple of really good blow-up quotes that you have. The book's very readable, and it's the kind of book you can put in a man's hands, because sometimes men aren't the best book readers. We know that from a fact, but you do some things that really get their attention. One comes from David Wilkerson. Satan would be a stupid devil to waste his ammo on those he's already killed. And so it kind of brings into the fact that you call this a different kind of sin, and argue, which I think might surprise a lot of our listeners, that Christian men are addicted to pornography at the same rates as non-Christians. What have you found?
Yeah, absolutely. The attack is on Christians. Satan's not worried about the unbelievers. There's plenty of unbelievers in sexual sin. In fact, I just read a report you guys did from Probe, and it said 90+% of people that are not pursuing the Lord are perfectly okay with all kinds of sexual immorality. The attack is on the strong men. The attack is on the believers. And so the enemy is out to muzzle the believers.
And again, one of the things you point out is this is research that was done by Barna Research. George Barna is on the program with us oftentimes. Of course, now Barna Research run by Dave Kinnaman, and he's on the program as well, and Josh McDowell. And so Barna Research and Josh McDowell Ministries did really one of the most extensive surveys ever. And that's what led Josh to actually take issue of sexual sin and address it again. Now, those of us that have known Josh, and I've known him since the 1970s, when I first introduced him in front of a group in, I think it was 1973. So we've known each other a long time, but he recognized that this is the big issue in the church today, and yet it isn't always addressed. Now, kudos to my pastor and other pastors that have addressed that, have actually tried to provide ways in which people can have safety and to even preach on this and to actually have a covenant with your eyes. But the bottom line is this is a big issue, and one of the reasons it is, as you also point out, it's not just a problem in the congregation. Sometimes it's a problem from the pulpit too, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons the church isn't doing a great job of addressing this today. In my opinion, Kerby, we should be closing the doors to every church and inviting the men in to get this out. This is an epidemic underground. It's hidden inside the church. And I think one of the biggest reasons why the church is so afraid to address this is because it's reported that nearly half the pastors are struggling as well.
Well, and again, it's much easier to do. As the old guy around the table, I can remember, and I was sharing with you off air, that when I first started writing about ethical issues, and I've always had at least a chapter in these books on Christian ethics on pornography, but back when I first started writing about that in the 1980s, we talked about the fact that to get access to pornography was either to go to a bookstore and buy, one of those magazines, or to get something that would be considered hardcore, you'd have to go to kind of a seedy section of town to do that. And so there were a lot of things that just from a social point of view would keep pastors or other men from walking into those bookstores or going into those sections of town. But now with the access that is on the internet, you can actually keep that as a secret sexual sin. And isn't that part of the problem too?
Oh, absolutely. And more than that, you don't have to go look for it on the internet. It'll find you.
It goes looking for you. Yeah.
It will find you, and it will find your children. We live in a world where we have programmatic advertising online and marketing that is sent to us on purpose.
And again, they're looking for you. And again, if you look at some of the statistics, when they used to ask when is the first time you saw some kind of sexual image, back in the old days when, maybe some kids saw Playboy, maybe the teen years, now you're seeing these very young kids, even sometimes before grade school, seeing them accidentally. So we need to take a break. And when we come back, I want to talk about where this goes, because you talk about the fact that men maybe who hide and deny the struggle eventually begin to accept it. And then we want to, of course, talk about what needs to take place and how to really address this issue. So it's all part of this book. It's been out for some time, but we have a link to Jeremy's website as well as information about this book, Unmuzzled, in case you'd like to get a copy. 240 pages, about 30 chapters. We'll cover as much as we can, but we need to take a break. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
College students have been convinced they face danger everywhere. A comment becomes a microaggression. A name on a university building is a link to the country's racist past. But the greatest threat is a student without a mask. A recent column talks about how dangers become the woke weapon on campus. University restrictions due to the pandemic have essentially become institutionalized. Now that some of the restrictions are being lifted in many parts of the country, administrators, faculty, and students might have to learn to adapt. A few years ago, I interviewed Jonathan Haidt, one of the authors of the book, The Closing of the American Mind. He and his co-author devoted a section of their book to the idea of safetyism, a generation that was protected from physical dangers with bike helmets and other devices came to believe the world was dangerous and required parents and teachers to protect them. Then came the pandemic, lockdowns, and mandates. Protection from dangers allowed those in control to have even more power. In the past, there have been speech codes and justification for disinviting any speaker that might offend student sensibilities. The pandemic provided an excuse to control even more behavior on campus. Returning to normal will be difficult. The column tells the story of trying to revive a Harvard tradition, but then learning that it would be strictly controlled by the Harvard Committee on Student Life. In Massachusetts, 95% of all eligible ages have at least one dose, while 98% of students are vaccinated. But the danger of COVID is amplified and distorted. Returning to normal on campus will be difficult for two reasons. First, administrators aren't ready to relinquish control. Second, students are still willing to comply because they fear any danger on campus. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about this book, Unmuzzled, escaping sexual sin and especially escaping Satan's grip on men. And we're talking about, of course, sexual issues, but we'll be very careful. But again, just a parental advisory for you. By the way, if you'd like to join us, since calls are coming in, might as well. 1-800-351-1212. Here's the deal. You can remain anonymous. And if you would want to share your story or your struggle or ask a question, you're free to do so. And we will take some of those phone calls. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. But I wanted to spend a little more time with J.S. Shelton. As I mentioned, this book, about 240 pages and 30 different chapters. So we will cover as many as we can, but I recognize that we may not cover all of it. That's why we recommend books, so you can get into it, read it. Also, I might just mention that you've got a very extensive appendix, Jeremy, and you have a place for not only notes, but then personal notes you can take. So you really intend for a man to go through this individually and evaluate it. But the way you've done it, it would be even better if you went through it with an accountability group or a small group. And so talk about how we can actually use this book in some kind of ministry.
Sure. When I wrote it, Kerby, that's written from a guy who wasn't a big reader. And I wasn't a big reader because I'd get 2 chapters in a book and then put it down. So when I wrote it, I realized I was writing it to men. So instead of it being a 17-chapter book like it originally was, it's now a 30-chapter book with less pages. So the biggest page count in one chapter in that book is about 10 pages.
Yes.
Most of them are 3 to 5 pages.
So you can read it very easily. It's got lots of stories, very well written. It's been out for quite some time, I might mention. So even though we're just talking about it now, this is actually something that maybe some of you have been able to see. Again, I oftentimes say I want you to support your local Christian bookstore, but since it's been out so long, it may not be on the shelves. If you find it in the bookstore, great, because buying it encourages bookstores to buy more of them. But if not, we've made it very easy for you to order it. It's relatively inexpensive, and it's something that we would encourage you to do. Let's see if we can come back to one of your key points. Men who hide and deny their struggle sexually eventually move from mourning their sin to accepting it. That's one of the problems that we're dealing with as well, is that even then when somebody talks about the issue of pornography or sexual sin from the pulpit or in a Sunday school class, a lot of men just aren't necessarily reacting right to that because they've already sort of made their peace with it, haven't they?
Correct. We've become so desensitized to what sexual immorality is in the church. Again, I'm talking to believers. If you're a non-believer listening to this, I can't help you. God created sex between one man and one woman, and he has parameters and rules around that. And in the church today, we have done such a poor job of educating men and women on what those parameters are. Instead of preaching God's truth, biblical truth, we are preaching tactics and techniques.
And again, there's a concern about that. But first of all, let me pick up something you just said, men and women, because just a minute ago I talked about women. I teach a class that actually gets into some of the sexual issues in Bible school, and it's the second-year students, and it's usually on things like homosexuality, transgenderism, but we always get into the issue of pornography. And I found myself most of the time using the pronoun he, and I had a woman come up in my face and say, I really wish you would stop doing that because a problem of pornography is just as difficult for me as a woman as it is maybe for you as a man. And so it's helped me understand that we've always talked about it as a man's issue, but it's also becoming a woman's issue too, isn't it?
Yeah, sadly, if you go back and look at studies 30 years ago, it was very rare to find a Christian woman who, one, was struggling or two, would admit it. Today, we're looking at 30% plus have admitted to struggling with it.
There you go. Let's see if we can maybe also take on another one of those myths, and that is that you can kind of take it or leave it. There are some verses that you have in here. 1 Peter 2:11, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. And, of course, the Apostle Paul also on 1 Thessalonians 5, abstain from every form of evil. There's a sense in which sometimes people just think that I'm kind of easily walking towards, as you say, the gates of heaven, but instead we're really being pushed to the gates of hell, aren't we?
Absolutely. Now, make no mistake about it. If you say you believe in God, you better start believing in the enemy as well. The Lord tells us in his word, he gave Satan jurisdiction on this earth. And when you're a man and you set out to be all God has for you, you better watch out in this area. I believe this is the enemy's number one attack on men today.
And you mentioned jurisdiction. A lot of people say, well, we understand that Satan has jurisdiction over the world and over society. He's the prince of the power of the air. But you also have a section here in which you say sexual sin gives the enemy jurisdiction to come into your life. So what are some of the consequences of getting involved sexually? Because I think we've still bought the world's idea that, it's not that harmful. It's only going to affect me maybe sexually actually, it could maybe affect my marriage or my sexual relationships with my partner, but it doesn't have any other impact. But you are really here to say, no, it has great impact in a lot of different areas, doesn't it?
Yes. I mean, you read the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, and you'll find out that sexual immorality was the number one downfall of all these strong men we read about. There's a scripture, it's Matthew 12:29, and it says this: "How can you enter a strong man's home, plunder his goods, unless you first bind that strong man?" Now, that scripture's not talking about sexual immorality, but when I read it, it's the picture that I got.
Yes.
When a man is bound by sexual immorality, he may not realize it, but he has allowed his front door of his home wide open to the enemy.
I think so. And another aspect of that you talked about is these passive men, the muzzled man, because you've said that if you identify a passive Christian man, it's quite likely that that person is basically harnessed or muzzled by sexual sin. Talk about that if you might.
I mean, one, if we're Christian men, we're sons of the creator of this earth, God Almighty, there is no reason we should be passive in anything. And so when you find a Christian man who is passive and is not leading as the man, as the priest or the pastor of his home, you identify one of those men and you'll likely find a man that's looking at pornography, has a hidden sexual affair, or has had some sort of sexual fall in the past that he's unconfessed about.
Sure. And again, women, you're listening right now and saying, I've got this passive husband, doesn't seem to really be doing anything, and I don't understand what it is, but it probably had not occurred to you that may be the problem. And again, we've had some very prominent individuals, and you do talk about this in the book, you name names as well, very prominent ones, and I'm not going to try to embarrass every one of these Christian leaders that have fallen, but we recognize how many times it was due to sexual sin. Sometimes it was due to greed or inappropriate use of funds or whatever, but so often that is the case. And if you look at the, if you will, the body count of the Old Testament and the body count even some of the New Testament, especially in the Old Testament, you know what that is the case. And so your argument is that sexual sin is really not something you just must repent of. It's something you need to obliterate from your life. And that's, I think, the next step that we need to talk about, because what you want to do is ultimately releasing Satan's grip on your life. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. Back to why so many men are struggling, and I said they become desensitized to what's going on. I'm not hurting anybody by looking at pornography every now and then. I'm not hurting anybody by looking at a woman with a little lust in my eyes. I'm not acting out on it. So many men are desensitized in the church today to think that's okay. I even had a pastor, a senior pastor of a large church, tell me, be careful if you're going to go around telling men to confess their sexual sin. You may be responsible for divorces. So he cautioned me against calling it out. And so that's where the church, I think, is today as a whole. We're too afraid to call it what it is. And the Bible tells us, Genesis to Revelation, this is against your flesh. It's the only sin in the Bible that says it's against our flesh. It's a one-of-a-kind sin. And I believe that's why the enemy uses it more than anything in the lives of men.
It's one of the chapters you focus on that as well. When we come back, we're going to talk about, okay, how do I get a fireproof marriage? What should I do? I know, flee and certainly engage in all sorts of other actions and disruption and escape and those kinds of things. And then we'll talk about some of the warnings. And at the same time, as we go to a break, I suspect some of you would actually like to ask a question or make a comment. We did get one anonymous call. We'll probably mention that in just a minute. But if you'd like to join us, let's also open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. We are privileged to have in studio with us today J.S. Shelton, and we'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Had a couple people that gave some questions off air but didn't want to come on the air. I can understand that, and we'll get to some of those in just a minute. Talking about the book Unmuzzled by J.S. Shelton, and we also have a link to unmuzzledmen.com. And as you go there, it asks a very good question. Could sexual sin be holding you hostage from God's appointed destiny for your life? So there's a place where people can get a copy of the book. They can get a free chapter if they'd like to. And so you've made that possible. Have all the different endorsements from Larry Titus, Jimmy Evans, Josh McDowell, Todd McIntyre, to mention just a few. And then they can see a little bit more about you and maybe even schedule you to come and speak, because I think you might be available for men's retreats and church functions and things of that nature, aren't you?
Yes, sir. That's my passion.
So again, it's all available at the website at pointofview.net, and we'll get some of those calls in just a minute, and also I even mention a few that have been off air, but I want to give some hope, and one of the chapters is called Fireproof. As a matter of fact, we might remember Fireproof, the movie, but what can we do? Because you are really talking about how to escape sexual sin, and part of it is escape, part of it is flee, part of it is, of course, accountability and the rest, and to stay away from certain things. But what about that? Because you've got even a really good chart I'll hold up for people to see about how to look at this idea of what you can do when you stay away, or how you can flee, escape. But eventually, if you don't make any concrete steps, reminds me a little bit of what we see in the actually the epistle written by James, in which it ends up in death. And so talk about you have been able to encourage men and women to actually take control of their lives. What do you suggest that they do?
Yeah. The first step is transparency. We as men become so shameful, as Christian men, especially pastors. You know, you take a pastor who's struggling with this and you tell him, hey, you need to confess all this. Well, that is like death to that pastor. It's humiliation. We have to come to a point where we really believe what the Bible says. And that is, God has called us to be married to one woman, and we are to be one with her. That means she has to know everything. Now, there's some controversy out there in the church. What do you confess? What do you not confess? The Bible tells us that's his daughter. And I've never found anything in the Word that God says, you know what, son, it's okay for you to hold my daughter in bondage and not tell her what's going on for the rest of her life. We'll just deceive her whole life on earth. There's nothing in the Bible that says that. And so the first step is we have to be willing to be 100% vulnerable and honest with our wives.
Well, again, there's some great steps, and again, we will go through those as we go along the way. But again, one of the calls came in was anonymous saying, what if it's reversed? And it seems to me that in this case, we're talking about a man who may be struggling as well, but the wife is. And one of the things you found is these steps still work there as well, but also they're usually for some of the women are sometimes your experience. You've been in this longer than probably anybody other than when we've talked with maybe Stephen Arterburn or Josh McDowell. You find that there's some other underlying issues, aren't there?
Yes. In fact, in one of the early chapters, I address women. I say, if you're a woman reading this book, this is biblical truth for all God's children. This is primarily a man's issue, but we are seeing a rapid increase in women struggling with this. And I think it goes back to they are exposed at a very early age to this stuff. And so most women that struggle in this area have usually been wounded or neglected or manipulated by a man. If the men of this earth who are following Christ were truly following Christ and obeying the word of God, we would have less women struggling in this area. But because men are struggling at an alarming rate, almost 70%, and now it's projected as over 70% of Christian men are looking at pornography every single month.
Unbelievable. Yeah. And again, the point I'm making is that that may involve some other counseling. It isn't just the sexual issue. It's the symptom of some other issues that you might want to talk about. And there are very good Christian counselors out there that can begin to address some of those issues of abuse and neglect and all sorts of things that may be part of that as well. And we have talked about that before. We will certainly cover it as well. Before I talk about another anonymous one, we do have a listener in the state of Texas that would like to address this issue. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, brethren. How are you?
Very good.
We moved to an area and we cannot find a local church. We find seeker-sensitive churches that want to teach the exhorting, but not the reproving and rebuking. And, there has to be the balance. We don't hear them talking about sin in general, teaching against sin, preaching against sin, even including sexual sin on both sides of the aisle, if you know what I mean. They encourage social drinking, and I just think it's going to get even worse and worse, sending our kids into the public schools now that they're working to groom them in sodomy at a young age. And I'll just leave that with you guys and get off the air, and thank you.
Well, thank you. And again, one of the issues that we certainly have addressed before is just this whole idea of the church becoming more like the world. And you said you've seen the study that we've done through Probe Ministries. We did this 10 years ago. We've done it again more recently, in which we, first of all, we're just looking at born-again millennials. Now we've looked at everyone. But the sad reality, Jeremy, is that in all these surveys, whether we've done them, Barna surveys, Lifeway surveys, Baylor surveys, Christian Smith surveys, Pew surveys, GSS surveys, there's a lot. You come to the same conclusion. There is sadly not a whole lot of difference between the Christian world and the non-Christian world, and it's evidenced by the fact that too many people, if I can use Romans 12, 1 and 2, are conformed to this world rather than renewing their minds in Christ Jesus.
Absolutely. I met with 23 pastors. I won't name the church, but it's a very large church in the United States. And because of my business, I run a car business, I got to know most of these pastors because I would help them with vehicles.
Oh, sure.
And so when the Lord put on my heart to write this message, they were my go-to people. And I met with 23 of this church's pastors. 2 of them got back to me. When I say I met with them, I met and I said, how can I serve the men of this church? How can I help? Can I lead a group? Can I pray with people? Can I do one-on-one coaching? And all of them, all 23, this was over a 1.5-year period, paid me lip service. Oh, Jeremy, that is awesome. Good for you. Of the 23 pastors, I got 2 responses. The first response was from a senior pastor of this massive church, and it came in the form of a text about a week after we talked. And he said, can you help me buy a car? The second text was from another pastor of one of their other campuses, and it was this: could you do a podcast on how to buy a car? They could not see anything past me being a helper to them for cars. I just presented what I believe is the enemy's number one attack in their congregation and offered to help, to serve, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it.
That's amazing. One other question just before I take a break. This was off air, but again, this one from California just said, okay, and you sort of alluded to that before. If we really do start addressing pornography in the church, will it increase the divorce rate? And I have found, and I've been in contact with a number of individuals that have taken the time to confess to their wives, or they have raised the issue. In many cases, that has deepened the relationship rather than broken the relationship. Now, the initial reaction is, but I think in this world, anybody that's thinking that pornography is not an issue is really maybe in the head in the sand group that Marlon Maddox used to talk about as well. But still, it seems to me, even that if that is a risk, that is a way to provide people freedom and to finally unmuzzle so many individuals that could be following God's best for their life. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I talk to a lot of men nowadays, and that is a hot button issue. How much do I tell my wife? Do I need to tell her about stuff I've already confessed or talk to my accountability partner? We are so afraid of losing our marriage, and that's a normal, healthy thing. But we deserve death If you've had an addiction to pornography and you're hiding that from your wife, or you've had an affair or any sexual immorality and you're hiding from your wife, you deserve death according to the Lord. Through Jesus Christ, we don't have to take death. We have forgiveness through the grace and blood of Jesus Christ. And so, men, if you're listening, or women, if you have hidden sexual sin in your marriage and you are unwilling to confess that, you don't deserve that partner anyways.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple other issues. And those of you that have called in and even left a text or an actual voicemail, we appreciate that. But we are, again, talking with J.S. Shelton. The book is entitled Unmuzzled, Escaping Sexual Sin, Satan's Grip on Men. We'll come back and maybe just talk a little bit about what was God's ideal for marriage and how we can use that as a very powerful way to cause us to begin to do the right thing according to our spouses and our culture. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking about the book Unmuzzled by J.S. Shelton. And Jeremy with us, Escaping Sexual Sin, Satan's Grip on Men. We only have a few minutes, and so that's why I thought we would talk about fireproof. We talk about what we can do to really make a difference in our marriage. You have whole sections and chapters on the idea of fleeing and all the rest. But maybe the key issue is you have a section here where you just talk about God's design for sex inside of marriage alone. And it seems to me today that the opportunities for sexual temptation are greater than they've ever been before. And so if you think about this, when the Apostle Paul was warning people in the first century about sexual temptations, at a time when you didn't have the internet, you didn't have television, you didn't have billboards that were around, you did have temple prostitution, you had some things. If it was true then, it's even more true. So we need to come back to basics. So what about God's plan for sex inside of marriage?
Yeah, first, it's between one man and one woman. And God created sex as a blessing, not a sustenance. And we as people today see it as something that we desire and it fulfills us. You know, men tell me often, it's a need of mine. God never said in his word that sex was a need. Nowhere in science and nowhere in the Bible does it say you need oxygen, food and water and sex in order to survive. But we have so confused it because our flesh goes back to 1 Corinthians 10:13. It's the only sin that's against our flesh. Everything else is outside the body.
And again, I might just mention, you have a chapter on there, is sex a physical need? So you go into that in some detail. But you end with a warning, and I think that is good to actually focus on. I think by now most people sort of got the idea of the warning, but talk about that, because this is a real concern, and there is a need for people to begin to think about how to unmuzzle themselves. And we talk about in this chapter on unmuzzled men, but we can also talk about unmuzzled women. And there are some really important issues. And you kind of end with a warning and some marching orders. Give us that,
absolutely. The book focuses on God's biblical directives for freedom. We have put so much forward in the church on this topic, which is great. But we have failed to put down what the Bible actually says about how you get free. And that's what the book's about. It's about staying away, fleeing, and escaping this. And it's all tied to God's design and parameters for sex. The warning in the back is around where pornography is headed. In fact, Kerby, it's already here.
I thought we could get into that. Why don't you go into that for just a minute?
And it's talking about the virtual reality component of our world.
Mm-hmm.
And where pornography is already at is virtual reality and augmented reality and all the technology that comes around that. And today, it's hard to get free from pornography if you're addicted to it. I liken it to a muzzle.
Mm-hmm.
VR is going to put men in a straitjacket, and it's going to be almost impossible to escape it.
And again, right now we're talking about putting on something like a kind of a headset, but you could talk about in the future they might have body suits and the rest, and with artificial intelligence and virtual reality, and the fact that right now even these various goggles that you wear have a level of visual acuity which is better than your eyes, so it can be feeling so real. And if you've ever seen somebody put that headset on, and then maybe the images of them having to jump off a cliff, I mean, it's just as real as reality itself. And so that's looking before you even get to the issue of sexuality, which of course heightens various kinds of endorphins and adrenaline and other things, and imprints in your brain. Like you said, you talk about a muzzled man now being in a straitjacket. That's really what the future is. And so what we're trying to do is warn people. Now, I can go back to my cliff analogy. Don't jump off the cliff, because we are headed for a time in which it's going to go from bad to worse. Just as we saw that it used to be hard to get pornography unless you went to a somewhat difficult area of town, sometimes even a dangerous area of town. Now it made it so easy for people to get it on their phones and their computers. We're moving to a third stage now, which is going to make it more real than reality itself.
Yeah, it is. And it's already here, Kerby. There's already been recorded divorces of women finding out their husband is watching pornography via VR. They walk in on him, and the wife's response is, "It was so real, he was cheating on me."
Mm-hmm.
And so the body suits, the hologram technology, the AI is already here. And if men don't get out of this now, you're going to fall right into it. Because if the Lord keeps us on this earth, we're all going to be immersed in that kind of technology.
So again, another point of this is, of course, get a copy of your book, and we've made it very easy for people to obtain that. They might find it in the bookstore, but if nothing else, you can get it very easily there by going to unmuzzledmen.com. And let's, for a minute, just talk about what's available there. First of all, people, if they would like to know more about you, they can click on that button that says About the Author. If they'd like to have you actually come, there's a place for speaking requests. So this might be something you might want to do. I would certainly say, you pastors, if you have not been addressing this from the pulpit, then at the very least do a men's retreat where maybe Jeremy comes and speaks, or you use some of the material that is there. And then you have, of course, a purity challenge and a number of other things. That comes from chapter 22 of your book. And these are just great resources that we want to put in your hands, because if you haven't paid attention, I hope you understand by now, we say that this is a problem that has been bad, but it's going to get worse. And the way we can deal with it is not to ignore it, which is really what most churches are doing right now, but to actually address it. And this is one resource that you've made available. You would rather just be selling cars, but you took the time to write a book, and then you thought that was that. And I think you found out now that I guess there's some other activities that God is calling you into, isn't it?
Well, Kerby, this is my passion now, and it's unbelievable when you get to be used by God. And I'll end with this. If you're a man who is struggling and has tried everything you can imagine, this book is for you, because that was me. Pornography was my struggle. I struggled with it in high school, through college, up into my marriage. And I wrote this book for every man who has hidden sexual sin in their lives and is ready to be free of it.
One last time, let me mention that as you go to the website, unmuzzledmen.com, and you don't have to remember that because we have the link at our website. Just go to pointofview.net, follow the link. There is a way in which you can get a free chapter from the book. So some of you might say, okay, I'd like to see what this is like, and all you have to do is click on that button there. You can download a chapter and read it, or maybe pass it on to somebody that needs it. And if you found yourself today, as we were going through this, thinking, I need to hear this again, or I knew somebody and I know somebody that needs to hear this, you can go to our website right now. There's a red button there that says watch or listen. So you can listen to it, download a podcast, very easily send it to anybody. You might say, this is something you might be interested in. The watch, of course, you can watch it there, but in just a few hours, it'll be on the YouTube channel. And since you're in studio, you can see Jeremy and get a chance to see some of the books that we're holding up here and actually use this in an effective way. So don't walk away from this not doing anything. We've given you some action items, and Jeremy, I appreciate you driving over here and coming in studio with us today.
Thanks, Kerby. It's an honor.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will get into some other topics. This is a topic we will address again, and I just wanted you to know about this book. It's been out for some time, but we wanted to give it the kind of attention that it deserved, and so he's been with us. But when we come back, okay, we got to talk about what's going on in Ukraine and some very interesting things about how the media is covering and seemingly sometimes covering up some issues, and sometimes the first casualty in war is news and information. So we're going to get into that in some detail. Also bring a couple other stories because there are things happening all over the country, especially in Congress right now. We'll talk about that as well. So we're going to go and devote an hour to that. And if you want to ask questions, make comments, feel free to give us a call. 800-351-1212. That's all we have this hour. But I hope you'll stay tuned because we have more to talk about just in a few minutes from now. We'll be right back.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, that is 1-800-351-1212. Let me point you to some of the articles we've posted today on the website. First one from David French. Going to spend some time talking about that. The best of compassion, the worst of religious power. And it will explain something I mentioned briefly yesterday, and that is, why is Kiev now called Kyiv? And we talked about yesterday why that's changed, but I may cover that again because some people tune in and tune out, maybe don't know why the actual capital of Ukraine's name has changed. Actually, the name hasn't, the pronunciation has, and there's a very good reason for that, but also why Kyiv, or Kiev, depending on how you want to say it, actually is very important to the Russian Orthodox Church. And then I want to also address the way in which the mainstream press, the establishment press, have been criticizing any attempt to make any kind of significance out of what was reported by the Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland on this idea of biological labs. So it's worth a mention. But before we're done, I want to get into some other issues as well. A very good piece that came out by Robert Knight, Disney and the Media's War on Children. Actually, it's called Disney, Big Pharma, and the Media's War on Children. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And woke corporations. And before we're done, thought I might end with a good piece by our good friend Colonel Alan West, America's First Liberty. In between then, we'll get into some other aspects about the fact that we now have earmarks back being used in Congress. Just recently passed a 2,727-page bill to fund the government. And, of course, government gives itself a big raise. Oh, I'm so surprised. So we will get into some other issues besides Ukraine. But I like to use some of these times when we have an hour to educate you about some things that aren't being covered by the mainstream press because they're religious and they don't really cover religion very well. And so that's the first thing. And then some others that are covered, I think, inappropriately. There's just almost been this idea that anytime we disagree with anything, or anytime something is contrary to the Biden government, the press will censor it instead of saying either that's wrong, or now they'll censor it sometimes by just simply saying it's disinformation, misinformation, Russian propaganda. But now they're calling it treason, and even suggesting that maybe the Justice Department should step in and remove some of these prominent people in the media from their positions. I thought we had a First Amendment. I might be wrong on that, but so we'll get into those too. But let's take the first one. And I mentioned it yesterday, but it's worth going into in more detail. David French has been on the program with us before, both in studio and by phone, points out that we do have a religious roots to this war, and I think the press has done a poor job of covering it. Let me just read from him for a minute. He says, as you watch the horror unfolding in Ukraine, you're watching two immensely important competing religious events unfold in real time. First, Russia's invasion is laced with religious elements. In many ways, it's a religious war representing a religion at its worst. But second, as we watch the Ukrainian and international church race to Ukrainians' aid, we're seeing Christianity at its best. But let's focus on the first, and that is, he actually quotes an essay which has a link, so if you'd like to read it on your own, you can do so, because this is the first article we've posted on our website. It was entitled, Putin's Orthodox Jihad. Now, it's written by a former analyst for the National Security Agency who's also an Orthodox Orthodox Christian. And his name is John Schindler. Well, Schindler describes this, what he calls ideological fusion between the Russian Orthodox Church and the FSB, which is basically Russia's intelligence service, kind of like the KGB, which we now talk about as well. And so there is this idea of both politics and church coming together. Now, we believe that there should be a separation of institutions like church and state, and theoretically maybe some of that exists, but not as much as you might imagine, because he then goes on to, and I'm now quoting from John Schindler, who's quoted in the article by David French, in which he says that the Russian Orthodox Church basically has the Kremlin's endorsement and depicts a West that is declining down to its death at the hands of decadence and sin, mired in confused unbelief, bored, and failing to even reproduce itself. How does that relate to some of the things we just talked about last hour? I think you see that there. And the idea of not even being able to reproduce itself. We're in this kind of demographic winter that is taking place. Russia is declining dramatically, but so is most of Europe and even now the United States. So he points out that Schindler's piece, little noticed at the time, is evidence of the fact that Vladimir Putin's religious motivations are very significant and now have even grown more overwhelming, because then he quotes from a man by the name of Giles Fraser, who argues, I should say, in a website called Unheard, quote, that Putin regards his spiritual destiny as the rebuilding of Christendom based in Moscow. Now, again, you've got to roll your eyes at this, throw your hands in the air, as somebody across the screen was doing as well. We're going to go and kill innocent people to rebuild Christendom. Okay, but again, recognize we're trying to help you understand the bizarre motivation for what has unfolded before our very eyes. And he goes on to point out that one of the things you have to understand is that when you look at the capital of Ukraine, used to be called Kiev, and the Russians call it Kiev, so we'll use their phraseology. We call Kiev the mother of all Russian cities. For us, Kiev is what Jerusalem is for many. Russian Orthodoxy began there, so under no circumstances can we abandon this historical and spiritual relationship. So the point he's making is simply when we look at Kiev, or now we call it Kyiv, as nothing more than a capital of a country, it's the Jerusalem, if you will, for the Russian Orthodox Church, for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so basically, David French summarizes it this way. He says, to make this as simple as possible, Putin has fused Russian identity with the Russian Orthodox Church and sees his nation and his church as a bulwark against Western decadence, and is now not just attempting to seize his church's Jerusalem, but actually forcibly reuniting his church after a schism that it rejects. As he says, Putin isn't trying to recreate the Soviet Union, which is the line you get from our secular news outlets. He says, that is David French says, the better analogy is a deeply religious Russian empire that existed before the Russian Civil War. So that's the negative. When we come back from the break, I want to talk about the positive, because I do want to be positive about that. And we have seen not only the worst of religion in the unholy alliance between Vladimir Putin and Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church, but we've also seen the best of Christendom with all the individuals, including some of you in the listening audience, that have stepped up and made a difference. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll get into kind of the bizarre way we've seen the mainstream press cover some of the stories about these biolabs. And I want to get into that, and then we'll move on to some other topics. So let's take a break. By the way, if you'd like to join us, calls coming in. Might as well open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
College students have been convinced they face danger everywhere. A comment becomes a microaggression. A name on a university building is a link to the country's racist past. But the greatest threat is a student without a mask. A recent column talks about how dangers become the woke weapon on campus. University restrictions due to the pandemic have essentially become institutionalized. Now that some of the restrictions are being lifted in many parts of the country, administrators, faculty, and students might have to learn to adapt. A few years ago, I interviewed Jonathan Haidt, one of the authors of the book, The Closing of the American Mind. He and his co-author devoted a section of their book to the idea of safetyism, a generation that was protected from physical dangers with bike helmets and other devices came to believe the world was dangerous and required parents and teachers to protect them. Then came the pandemic, lockdowns, and mandates. Protection from dangers allowed those in control to have even more power. In the past, there have been speech codes and justification for disinviting any speaker that might offend student sensibilities. The pandemic provided an excuse to control even more behavior on campus. Returning to normal will be difficult. The column tells the story of trying to revive a Harvard tradition, but then learning that it would be strictly controlled by the Harvard Committee on Student Life. In Massachusetts, 95% of all eligible ages have at least one dose, while 98% of students are vaccinated. But the danger of COVID is amplified and distorted. Returning to normal on campus will be difficult for two reasons. First, administrators aren't ready to relinquish control. Second, students are still willing to comply because they fear any danger on campus. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We'll stay on Ukraine for a little bit longer. And again, if you'd like to join us and ask a question, make a comment, you are welcome to do so. 1-800-351-1212. Our first article today by David French came out a couple days ago, but I just wanted to post it finally today, although I've been referring to it indirectly for some time. The best of Christian compassion, the worst of religious power. We just talked about, and I probably will put this in a future commentary, this unholy alliance between Vladimir Putin, the Russian military, and the Russian Orthodox Church. By the way, I'm not painting with a broad brush. I recognize many Orthodox Christians, whether in Russia or Ukraine or whatever, don't agree with that, but I'm talking about the way it has been used and manipulated by Vladimir Putin, and it is the bizarre idea that ultimately we can extend Christendom. I mean, you start seeing some of this and you believe, does he really believe that it is his spiritual destiny to rebuild Christendom and to ultimately base it in Moscow? But again, we've seen leaders in previous centuries want to do things like that, so I guess we shouldn't be terribly surprised. Let's talk about the positive for just a few minutes. And that is, again, if you heard our broadcast last week from the National Religious Broadcasters, we told some incredible stories about that, which I thought were very encouraging. Ed Cannon was with us. He's with Far East Broadcasting Company. We talked about how they had developed web pages and streaming for the churches so they can still have contact with their members. They did it first for COVID, but now during, of course, war, this is still a way they can communicate with them. And, of course, we talked about this one evangelist that was actually at the Bot Radio Network who was talking about the fact this may be the greatest evangelistic harvest in the history of Ukraine. But let's also talk about what people are doing. And David French talks about the Baptist World Alliance Church in Ukraine feeding and sheltering people. He says, I'm thinking of Samaritan's Purse setting up emergency field hospitals in Ukraine. I'm thinking of churches that are sending teams to Moldova to help Ukrainian refugees. But if I can quote from our Southern Baptist friends for just a minute, this is interesting because this comes from one individual that actually works in this regard, who is Brent Leatherwood. He's the acting president of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And he says, this is really personal for us in the Southern Baptist world. Most people don't realize it, but Ukraine has the second largest population of Baptists in Europe. In churches across America, he says, pastors are utilizing prayer guides, partnering with Send Relief and other organizations helping on the ground. And so even though the particular article, and it's the first article on our website, pointofview.net, and I encourage you to read it in its entirety, talks about the negative, it ends in the positive, and sometimes we see the best of religion and the worst of religion right there. I might just for a minute also mention that we were talking off air. Doug is our engineer again today. Thank you, Doug. And he was talking about how one of the ways they're getting money in there is they're renting Airbnbs. Of course, they're not there, but that's just a way to provide money to some of those individuals that are in places in Ukraine that have an Airbnb, and people that are doing all sorts of things through various methods. And because the internet is still up, Ed Ken and I were talking about that. It's quite possible that Vladimir Putin decided not to destroy the internet because he wanted these negative pictures to come out and maybe scare the Ukrainians. Didn't work, but nevertheless, that is the case. And of course, Elon Musk and others have made it possible for internet to go on, even if they were to take some of that down. But it also brings me to a commentary I have coming out next week, which I've already recorded, because you also have seen the freezing of these accounts. And at the one point, we have to say that, look, they've been able to freeze financial accounts for Russia. They've shut off the Russian central bank's access to hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign reserves. And we say, great, glad we're doing that. But I always try to remind you that the people most affected by this are the Russian citizens, some of whom may actually completely disagree with Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But we've also seen how the International Monetary Fund has suspended the Taliban's access to various funds. We've seen, for example, even financial transaction freezing Iran. And all of those we say, good, they're our enemies. Then we look at Canada and go, look what happened to the truckers. Again, Justin Trudeau was able to freeze bank accounts and financial accounts. And whether you agree with the truckers or not, you can't really call them enemies. You may disagree with them, but can you not see that if they can freeze an account that the government disagrees with, can you also see, and I wish my liberal friends would see this, that someday you could be on the opposite side of that and they could freeze your account? And that's something we're going to talk about a lot more. But just before we take a break, I did want to acknowledge that just the other day, you might remember, we talked about the fact that there was this interview that was done. It was in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and it's where Senator Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, asked the Undersecretary of State, that's Victoria Nuland, a very penetrating question. And it was a worthwhile question because you could see that he wanted to make sure that this myth that had been out there, I think was in his mind, that there were actually all sorts of biolabs in Ukraine, were not the case. And instead, he got an answer I don't think he was looking for, because you have, again, Victoria Nuland saying Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian troops, Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we're working with the Ukrainians on how we can prevent any of these to actually fall into the hands of the Russians and Russian forces should they approach. wasn't the answer I think he was looking for, because for weeks you've seen people arguing that this idea that there were biohazard labs in Ukraine is Russian disinformation. Now, you would think that the statement by the Secretary of State, or Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland, would be kind of a game changer, and you would be wrong. Because the one that is now getting all sorts of attention is with the former representative from Hawaii, Tulsi Gabbard, who put out a little video saying there are 25 to 30 U.S.-funded biolabs in Ukraine. According to the U.S. government, these biolabs are conducting research on dangerous pathogens. Goes on to talk about this, and pathogens know no borders. This is something that the administration should not try to cover up, but actually should work with both Ukraine and even Russia to deal with that. And instead, what you have is, for example, Mitt Romney suggesting that this is giving aid and comfort to the enemy, that these are treasonous. Treasonous? Where did that word come from? You have people on The View, and I don't quote The View very often, but they're even suggesting that individuals like Tucker Carlson, who talked about this, or Tulsi Gabbard, should be put in prison. I mean, and you begin to say, have we lost any sense of balance here? Now, the argument they say is you taking it out of context. Okay, we understand the context. She didn't say they were biohazard labs, but neither did Tulsi Gabbard. I've got her tweet here. She said U.S.-funded biolabs, not biohazard labs, not any kind of attempt at trying to do that. Now, I've had some people say these might not be undeniable facts. Okay, got that. But at a time when some of us have been a little bit concerned about some of the other biohazards that came out of Wuhan, China, shouldn't we be concerned about that? But instead, the reaction, almost the universal reaction, has been to say these people are spouting Russian disinformation. And again, I'm just quoting, of course, the Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland. If you go and watch some of the other broadcasts and some of the other statements, you recognize that these are validated by other individuals as well. And I'm just puzzled by this. One, because we've been through this whole, well, it is disinformation or misinformation, or in this case, we were told that it's Russian propaganda, when we're talking about things that have actually been reported by the U.S. government. And we may actually be dealing with very small issues. And again, I don't necessarily have to validate the argument of Tulsi Gabbard that these are undeniable, or that there's 25 to 30 of these biolabs. If there's just one of those, that's enough. And we recognize that if you've looked at some of the NIH funding, there are in round numbers about 300 biolabs around the world that in one way or another are engaging in something that we could consider potentially dangerous research. Some might be involved in gain-of-function research, some might not. But to actually label all of the concerns, which I think seem pretty legitimate to me, as Russian disinformation is a puzzle to me for sure. So anyway, I did want to address that because I didn't want people to say, you know, Kirby's involved in actually preaching Russian disinformation. I'm just giving you the actual quote, and I read the actual quote from the Undersecretary of State, Victoria Nuland. And so you might keep that in mind when you hear all the hue and cry that is unfolding over these last few days. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, going to spend some time now talking about Congress because, again, with so much focus on Ukraine, you probably have not noticed the amount of money that the United States Congress wants to spend. And it is not their money, it's your money because you send in the tax dollars. And the sad reality is, even though you send in the tax dollars, it doesn't even come close to covering the spending of the government. And we have mentioned on numerous occasions, you can go on different websites. Matter of fact, if you look at my piece on money, our booklet on money, even the one on debt, you can go and find out that we are actually spending twice as much money as we're pulling in from corporate income taxes, individual income taxes, and the rest. So let's just real quickly at least mention, and that's all you're going to get probably, and probably more than you will get from the establishment media, how the Congress decided to spend your money, because the House of Representatives passed the $1.5 trillion, that's with a T, $1.5 trillion, on a bill that was 2,727 pages. Did any member of Congress read that? And you know the answer to that. They did not. And this will fund the government actually just through the rest of this fiscal year. Not even the entire year of 2022. It just takes you to the rest of the fiscal year. And, of course, the government gave itself a big raise. How much so? Well, let's talk about this for just a minute. The only argument you could make, I think, is it could have been worse, but it's still terrible. And let's look at some of the numbers. Republicans and Democrats, so there's enough blame to go around, agreed to a $730 billion in discretionary spending. That's an increase. And $782 billion in defense. That's also an increase. And, of course, it also includes another, in addition to that, $13.6 billion in humanitarian assistance and military assistance for Ukraine. Now, the good news is that if you are convinced that we have a depleted military, I think that's probably a reasonable argument to be made. Then when you look at military procurement, you see that there was enough to begin to build some battle force ships, to actually deploy some F-35s and some KC-46 tankers and a number of other things. But in order to get that kind of spending for the defense, which is usually argued for by the Republicans, then the Democrats had to get theirs. So you also see that now Health and Human Services will get $108 billion. That's an 11% increase, including about $45 billion for the National Institute of Health, $29.9 billion for Administration for Children and Families. And if you're in the process of paying your taxes, notice that we've also given the IRS a tax benefit as well. They will receive an additional $675 million. That's a raise as well. By the way, last year they found that agents only answered about 11% of the phone calls to the IRS. So maybe that'll increase the percentage of phone calls that'll be answered. I doubt it, but nevertheless. What about climate change? Oh, we knew that'd be in there, of course. $3.2 billion for, quote, energy efficiency and renewable energy subsidies. Does the word Solyndra make any sense there? $3.1 billion for the Department of Transportation, $1.5 billion for climate diplomacy. Climate diplomacy. That's got to be John Kerry. And $100 million for environmental justice, whatever in the world that is. And as I mentioned in passing, and I won't even go into the details, it just gives you indigestion, the earmarks are back. And that is something where these are earmarks. I'll just pick on the outgoing Alabama Senator Richard Shelby was able to get $60 million for the University of South Alabama College of Medicine in Mobile, $32 million for dredging the Mobile Harbor, $100 million for the Mobile downtown airport, on and on. You go down this list. And these earmarks have been something that originally Congress tried to get rid of, but they are back. I know it's depressing. Sorry to cover it. Just thought that it would be worthwhile for at least you to hear it from us. because I'm not sure how much you've had a chance to hear from the establishment media. But our second article I did want to get to because it's from our good friend Robert Knight. It's entitled Disney, Big Pharma, and the Media's War on Children. I'm just going to really look at Disney a little bit because it's a long piece. But again, he's reminding us that if you're not been paying attention, there has been a particular piece of legislation that has moved through the Florida legislature. And the way in which the transgender, LGBTQ, liberal press, and everybody has covered it, has just called it the Don't Say Gay, which has nothing to do. Matter of fact, the word gay is not even in the bill. What it attempts to do is simply say that, look, if you're going to talk about such issues as sexual orientation, gender identity, you have to wait till at least they're a little bit older. And so basically it prevents you from having school personnel or even third parties coming in and talking to 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, or 8-year-olds. That would be kindergarten to third grade about all these issues. These are young kids. I can remember when I was in the second and third grade, and let's face it, I had a homosexual uncle, but I didn't know that he was, and I didn't know all the details about it, and I didn't need to know about all the details of it. And that is an individual growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area. So what kind of instruction can you imagine taking place in Stockton, California, Augusta, Georgia, Tupelo, Mississippi, Birmingham, Alabama, wherever this might be educated? And nevertheless, because this bill has been making its way through the legislature, then the CEO of Walt Disney decided to actually contact the Republican governor, that'd be Ron DeSantis in Florida, and explain that they were very much opposed to this. And so as a result, since the governor, Ron DeSantis, who doesn't suffer these kinds of accusations well, said, he didn't say you can go pound sand, but he might as well have. And so as a result, then the CEO of Walt Disney decided that they would then contribute $5 million to the Human Rights Campaign. If you follow that, they've said, we're not going to take the money until you do more than just give us $5 million. Which is amazing. But as I pointed out, again, the parental rights and education law is one that would just prevent you from talking about such issues as sexual orientation and gender identity and all the rest in kindergarten to the third grade. And even then, all you're simply saying is, if you want to inject all those ideas, by the time the children are 9 or 10, fair game. But that was still a bridge too far for many of those individuals. And again, Robert Knight goes into it in more detail, but just simply to say that he says for a company that has made billions from children, he says it's more than ironic that Disney is against protecting children's innocence. Disney instead stands with the Progressive Teachers Union, he says, that insist on keeping the public clueless about some of this sexual indoctrination. And, of course, the media has been in lockstep. I saw a printout the other day on the number of various news outlets, liberal news outlets mostly, that use the phrase, don't say gay. That was a phrase that was come up with the LGBTQ individuals. And the sad reality was that I would at least think that there would be a little bit of shame on the part of at least one or two news outlets to come up with a different phrase. But no, I mean, it's like they're all just cutting and pasting from the text that they probably received or the email they received, and it's almost like we don't even have somebody having enough self-respect to try to write it in a different way. They use almost the same words. Of course, they use the same phrase, don't say gay. And of course, I saw a column a while back that said, don't say gay. And that's, again, just an illustration of what many individuals, not all, but many individuals in the so-called establishment media, they've sunk to the lowest level possible. And so that is the case. And so, again, what you have is this interesting interaction between the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who has made it very clear that there is a zero chance, he said, that he would cave to a woke corporation like Disney, even though they have, if you think about it, the largest footprint in Orlando, one of the largest footprints in Florida. Think about that. I'm well aware of the fact that Disney owns more land in Orlando than anybody else. I think number 2 is a car dealership that owns a lot of land. And matter of fact, he tends to be really involved in Christian media, but we'll get that another day. And so as a result, this is not only where he backs this bill about protecting young people from sexual orientation, he also is actually backing a bill that would ban critical race theory and what's called equity propaganda. His direct quote was this: "No taxpayer dollars should be used to teach our kids to hate our country or to hate each other." 3 cheers for Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, and it's in our second article. And if you'd like to read it in its entirety, it's on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just as a program note mention that tomorrow we're going to have Dr. Arthur Brooks on. We've talked with him over the years about so many different issues. Of course, he's talked about who gives and who cares, and talks about the fact that oftentimes liberals talk about caring, but it's really the conservatives that are the ones out there giving, not only money, time, even blood. It's just amazing. Then he's written quite a bit on the whole issue of the Free Enterprise Institute and the free enterprise system, system and talked about capitalism and socialism. More recently, he's talked about this idea of happiness and earned success. We'll get into that with him tomorrow. He has been, of course, a professor at Syracuse University. Then until recently, was the head of the American Enterprise Institute. Now is on the faculty at Harvard University and both the Kennedy Institute as well as he's also in the Harvard Business School. And so we'll be talking to him about happiness, earned respect, and a number of other things that I think you will appreciate. So again, he will be with us tomorrow. Just before we wind down today, I want to first of all mention the article that we posted yesterday by Kevin Williamson, in which he said, "Are we at war?" And it sounds like a funny question until you realize that what he's saying is that if Vladimir Putin believes we're at war, we're at war. And we saw that before during the fact that radical Muslims thought they were at war with us, but we didn't think so until 9/11, and that changed everything. And, of course, we've seen how this has played out, and as a result has caused us to say, should we actually be so timid about sending, like what in the Biden administration wanted to do until they rethought it, MiG-29 fighter jets from Poland to Ukraine by actually having them first sent to Ramstein Air Base, which is in Germany. But again, the point I'm making is it is quite possible that we may get involved in this military action anyway. And there's a very good piece, I haven't posted it here, but Dennis Prager reminds us that back in 1994, when you had the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, which they had inherited from the former Soviet Union, and signed an agreement which is known as the Budapest Memorandum. And that's where Russia, the United Kingdom, and the U.S. agreed to dismantle its nuclear weapons and delivery system. In return, Ukraine was assured that Russia, the United States, and the UK would refrain from threatening it and respect its independence and sovereignty and existing borders. Well, that didn't turn out so well, did it? Of course, the other argument is that they would not expand NATO, which has been the pretext in part for Vladimir Putin going in. Well, Dennis Prager has been basically raising questions as to whether or not this idea of going in or helping Ukraine, whether that's in America's best interest. And he says the argument goes like this. What Putin is doing is wrong, but essentially is none of our business. The United States has no interest in Ukraine. He says, to this argument, one can ask, other than an attack on America, when and where does America have an interest and why? If a Russian dictator can invade and decimate another country in an act of unprovoked aggression, and it's not to be in America's interest, what about China invading Taiwan, or Iran unleashing nuclear weapons against Israel, or North Korea doing so against South Korea? Why are Taiwan, Israel, and South Korea more in America's interest than Ukraine? And he says, I've supported, that is, Dennis Prager says, I've supported the notion of America first, but as a conservative and a religious conservative, he's Jewish, of course, I do not believe in America only. For the same reasons I believe in my family first, but I don't believe in my family only. And so he makes the case that we may be involved in war anyway, and the piece that we posted yesterday by Kevin Williamson actually points out that, yes, we could be. We already have seen a cyber attack. As a matter of fact, there are so many things I don't talk about every day because we run out of time. But what about the cyber attack against Israel already? And could there be a cyber attack against us? My Friday commentary is on that subject. And in some respects, I'm afraid that since I do these commentaries early, I'll have to change them. That's more than once I've had to actually redo a commentary because I thought something that was going to happen in the future happened closer. And my cyber attack commentary doesn't show up until Friday. My piece on Are We at War doesn't show up until a week from today, next Tuesday. We might have to change some of those just because of just the fast-moving pace of what is happening. And I hope that if nothing else, that will encourage you to pay attention to what we're talking about every day here on Point of View. And if you find yourself wanting to learn some of these ideas, pass them on to others, we've posted quite a number of articles. And of course, some of you, I think, want to get some of the material from Jeremy Shelton, who was with us the first hour. And again, you can watch it again by clicking on that button that says watch or listen. You can listen to it, watch it, or of course you can also go to YouTube and see it posted. But just before we wind down, my third article is from our good friend Colonel Alan West. Now, as some of you may know, he ran for the governor's race in the state of Texas and did okay, but he did not win. And he says, as I speak around the country, I'm often asked, how do we get our country back on track? He says, my answer is simple. As the longest running constitutional republic in the history of the world, we need to get back to our fundamental principles and values. Well, then he takes us through some of those values, and he raises some very good questions. He says, was America perfect on the day of the Declaration of Independence when it was signed on July 4th, 1776? He says, no, but the preamble of our Constitution challenged us to establish a more perfect union, and this is the cornerstone upon which to build it. And then he takes us through kind of some of the stories of Thomas Jefferson and John Locke and where these ideas came from, and spends a fair amount of time really recounting some of our history. But then he reminds us of a few of the famous quotes from Benjamin Franklin. For example, Benjamin Franklin said, those who would surrender essential liberty for temporary security in the end will deserve neither liberty nor security. And so he's been very concerned that we've surrendered some of our liberty because of the COVID lockdowns and those kinds of things. He also recalls, interestingly enough, that Benjamin Franklin was asked as he left the Constitutional Convention by Mrs. Powell, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us? And you remember the famous quote, a republic, if you can keep it. And he says, therein lies the problem. We are at a point where the leftist edicts supplant our laws. It's not legislators that blocked energy production in the United States, but it was, of course, the current president of the United States. And he talks about how individuals are bypassing right now the legislative process and even the checks and balances that were devised by our founders. And I've oftentimes said that if you thought taxation without representation was bad, you should see it now with taxation with representation, if you call that monstrosity of an omnibus bill as anything like representation. But he ends with this very famous quote, not from Benjamin Franklin, but from Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, he once said, if we forget that we are one nation under God, then we will be one nation gone under. Good way to end. And again, I've summarized a piece that you might want to read in its entirety, and it's our third article that we've posted for you there on pointofview.net. My commentary today is about campus danger and some of the various COVID restrictions still being used on campus to limit liberties. It fits very well with a piece by Alan West. And of course, we'll get into some of that tomorrow, no doubt, with Arthur Brooks. Dr. Arthur Brooks is a voice that we've enjoyed having on this program over the years and have valued so many of his articles and books. And if you do a survey of some of my viewpoints commentaries, you can use that search engine at the bottom. You will see that many times Arthur Brooks gets quoted because we certainly evaluate and appreciate his material that he produces. First of all, I want to thank Doug. Thank you for being here today. I think you're going to be here all week covering for a producer, actually an engineer that really needs your prayer right now. And also want to thank Elisa for covering for Steve, who's over there in Spain. So I want to thank Doug and Elisa for their help, and I want to thank you for listening and look forward to having you join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.